Probably would be surprised to learn that I'm pretty nervous tonight. This is our amazing event. It's a continuation of just a terrific day in Oyster River. Prior to this forum, we had an outdoor strings concert. And so I can feel the district, leaving the pandemic behind slowly. And just being able to see all of your bodies, many of you old friends who I've known for the full 9 years I've been here. So thank you for genuinely giving us this evening, this time tonight. So I did take the time to write a few notes. I'll be brief because this forum is not even closely about me. Tonight, we have an opportunity to listen and learn from our Asian American friends. We'll hear from Dr. Monica Chu, a distinguished professor from UNH. She is the keynote. We'll have panelists from our Asian American community who will share their real-life experiences. Listening carefully and hearing what they have to say builds our capacity to understand and our ability to provide empathy. What I also wanted to share tonight is that our district has been on this journey for 5 years. And the journey has been to be inclusive and to recognize the strength of diversity and to extend the gift of love and participation across all of our residents. We've been blessed this year with incredible student voice. Somebody asked me recently, what's one thing that's happened that's wonderful during the pandemic? And I would say almost instantaneously, it's the voice of our students. We've had a diversity, equity, and inclusion student group this year that has done so many great things for our student population. It has participated with our adult group, which has been 22 to 24 strong every other week, all year long, talking about this issue of diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. This has been an incredible year, very difficult for so many, but also we're beginning to see the silver lining. And the other piece I would say to you this year that's been incredible in the middle of a pandemic is the participation by our adults in this community. Every time this year that I've reached out for adult participation, regardless of the issue, you've all stepped up in ways that made the reports that we've written and the conversations we've had rich. Tonight is, unfortunately, the anniversary of the death of George Floyd. And, really resonates with me in terms of the work that we've been doing as a school system. And of course, the attack on our Asian Americans in Georgia and, the disgraceful behavior of some of our citizens towards seniors in our major cities towards Asian Americans. We believe as a district that these kinds of conversations are critically important. And another question that I'm often asked is, Oyster River is a tiny little pebble in the great scheme of our great country. And, what do we hope to accomplish? We hope to accomplish this: a rich conversation with our community about the issues that impact all of us. I'm pleased this evening to be able to introduce Jung Dai, who is one of our residents. And by the way, our student population in our district is 7.7% Asian American and Pacific Islander. It is by far our largest resident minority community. So this conversation is incredibly timely. I also would introduce UC Terrell, who's been a friend of mine since I moved into the district and she moved into the district. Both of these women have been incredible leaders and have participated in various ways to make our district a better place for our students. As we go through the evening, I just want to point out that there's 2 microphones. This is being streamed live and being taped. If you have a question or you want to add a comment to tonight's event, would please come to the microphone, because otherwise it won't be picked up in the streaming or on the tape. So please use the microphone. Questions are great, but also comments. If you have a comment that you want to make, I would just ask that you limit it to 3 minutes, because this is a good enough crowd that we could spend a lot of time this evening just hearing what people have to say. So with that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Yusi and Yahong and let them take it from here.
Yan Hong and I stand between you and our amazing keynote speaker, Monica Chu, but we wanted to let you know a little bit about why we put ourselves into this and why this feels almost like a wedding, actually. I was saying earlier that there's so many friends, so many people who have worked towards social justice, worked towards improving our community, and it's tremendous to see all of you here. I feel like saying, we are gathered here today. And there's so many ways to finish that sentence. I will say, I grew up in California. My father was a professor at Berkeley, an immigrant from China. He was the youngest tenured professor there at the time. And he met my mother, they got married, and I grew up surrounded by Asians. But whenever the question would come up, where are you from? It was always, my dad's Chinese and my mom's American. And of course, my dad was American too, but it never struck me. And then one day it did. And once you see that or hear that, you can't undo it. And so you just sort of become aware. But I always thought of myself as mixed race, as being both sides of the Venn diagram. It wasn't a narrow world, it was an expansive world. I was so lucky to be able to span both of these worlds. And so I went along and worked in social justice, worked in social entrepreneurship, mostly focused on Black and Latino, and also different socioeconomic barriers to success and opportunity in this country. And I didn't really reflect on it being about me until Atlanta. And the Venn diagram went from being so full to being just a little sliver in the middle, because my social justice friends didn't really know what it was like to be Asian. And my Asian friends hadn't necessarily been at the table or involved in these sort of conversations about racial equity and about how we can change the systems to move forward. So for me personally, there was a real urgency inside, and also sort of a gap at the community level that need to be filled. And of course, over the past couple of weeks, we've seen that there is a lot of turmoil in the world outside of us, and there are some communities that are being torn apart. And what you're showing by being here today, what I hope we are gathered here today to do, is to proactively listen, learn, stand together, so that when we go through these next stages of evolving into more equitable and inclusive systems, that we'll do that as a community and we'll be stronger for it instead of torn apart. It's been a real treat to get to know Yan Hong over the past, weeks, though of course I had known of her and her amazing daughters in the district. And so thank you, Yan Hong, for co-organizing, and maybe.
Thank you, Yusei. First of all, I want to thank for school district to offer this opportunity for us to get in together, have this event. And I also want to thank all of you come over here tonight to make this happen. So my name is Yan Hong Dai, last name Dai. So I came to US when about 20 years ago. So came to U.S. as a dependent of a student. My husband came over to U.S. for his PhD study, and later on I became a student myself. So get master's degrees in accounting, become a public accountant. So our family moved to Durham 2008. So I've been living here for like more than decades now. So we have 2 daughters. The one is in college. She goes to MIT. I have a younger daughter. She's 8th grade in middle school. So we love the community a lot, but over time, we always hear or perceived about the Asians or Asian Americans is a quiet group. It's not very visible to our community. So it started to make me think, I need to do more. I needed to contribute more, get more involved in the community. So about 2 years ago, I started to join the PTO group at the middle school. So I'm the PTO group treasurer for about 2 years now. So recently, back about 2 months ago, the Atlantic shooting just happened. So which is like a shock. Everyone is such a tragedy. And later on, you heard like elder woman getting beaten up in New York City on the street with no reason, just because their appearance. So that made me think, even though Durham is a small town, it's very peaceful. We live here very peacefully, quietly. But what if, like in the big cities, because all these incidents happens in the big cities, make you wondering, like, what if you go to the big cities? What about our children when they go out to the big cities? As you know, my daughter, she's in Cambridge. So she's there like for 4 years. So we start from a conversation because we have weekly chat. So after Atlanta shooting, as a mother, I started to worry. I asked her a question for the weekend. We chat or say, hey, did you hear the news? You must watch the news. What do you think? Are you afraid? Because in this big Boston, a big city. So she said, yeah, Mom, always there is the crazy people. So that did happen to me. Because one day, she and her friends walked from the campus, from MIT to a grocery store, do a grocery shopping, walking down the street, and there is one guy just getting really close to her, behind her back, say, yell, go back to your country. So then, after I heard that, it made my heart think. She grew up here. She was raised here. She valued Americans. She contributed to the community. She's a great young lady, working hard. Did a lot of volunteer work in high school and also in the college. Not only get good grades, also give back to our community. So then start make you think, when you yell people to go back to her country, this is her country. So that is unacceptable. So that's why I'm here. I will hope after we should all get coming together, educated to the group. I hope everyone in the future should realize Asian Americans are Americans. Asian history, American history is a part of American history. We are all together. Thank you very much.
Now my pleasure to bring to the stage Professor Monica Chu, who has been at UNH for a number of years in the English department, but doing so much more involved in the university's anti-racism work, though it's been through a number of different permutations and names, of course. And it's just a real expert in the history and also the storytelling and the literature that comes along with the history and the current issues of Asian Americans. So Monica, I'm delighted. I was hoping, Alexander. Just picture them as college students.
Right. Yeah, I never left the classroom, right? Classes end and I'm back in the classroom, so to speak. It's a good place to be. And I tell my students, you know, for the past, 3 semesters that even if you can't see my face, just know that I'm smiling under here because I really want to be here. And I do appreciate being here tonight. And I'd like to say thank you to both UC and to the superintendent, Dr. John Morris, who is the helm behind this large ship that we're sailing into, looks like a really very good and diverse future. So thank you also to those in the audience and those of you watching on YouTube to listen to what I have to say about the history of Asians to the United States. And I wish it could be a little bit more, you know, peppy, but I'm not feeling very peppy, having just finished my grading today. But I'm hoping that the images that you will see behind me will compensate for that. So today I'll focus specifically on Chinese American labor history, capitalist structures that required overseas recruiting to fulfill American labor needs, the notion of the yellow peril, the model minority, and conclude with Asians in New England. So I was given this tall order by UC. She said, can you do all of these things and then put it all together? And I said, let me think about that. So this is what you're gonna get. And at some point I'll stop and say, now I have to pick up this and that. So, but it will end kind of in a circuitous route back to here in New Hampshire. So before the arrival of Chinese sojourners to America, our nation already had been trading with China in the late 18th century. Our first trading vessel, the Empress of China, left New York for China in 1778. While Americans were latecomers to the China trade, following a history of European traders from Spain, Portugal, Holland, and Britain as early as the 16th century, by the late 18th, many of the nation's sailors, captains, merchants, and agents hailed from Salem, Massachusetts, just down the road. So Salem-built ships dominated the waters of the South Seas, and Salem itself was designated the 6th largest city in the new American nation. An interesting domestic note, because many of the products that we wanted, the United States or America wanted, was tea and porcelain. So here you have an image of a piece of china. That's where we get the name, because they were made in China. And also silk and nankeen, which is a very strong kind of yellow colored cloth. So an interesting domestic decorative note, and this is according to John Chen in his book, New York Before Chinatown. And I'll just tell you that anyone that I reference in my work, I have put a bibliography together and have sent it to UC. So if you want to see what some of these sources are and what more they have to say, they will be collected there. So according to John Chen, China cabinets assisted in middle and upper class interior design. While heavy or crude kitchen pottery was used only in the kitchens, China, which was painted porcelain from the so-called Celestial Empire, was showcased in a china cabinet, used only for special occasions in the homes of wealthier Americans. We arranged our dining rooms, and we still do, around china. The Peabody Essex Museum in Peabody, Salem, Massachusetts, has the world's second largest collection of china trade goods.
after the London's Victoria and Albert Museum. And if you haven't had a chance to go to the Peabody Essex, it is a gem and one of my favorite museums. And in yet another anecdote, the wealthy houses owned by Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, are what my colleague there, Robert G. Lee, calls crack houses. They were built from the profit American merchants made by exchanging opium that we brought to China, and we brought back Chinese tea. Other than silver bullion and opium, the Chinese exclaimed that we, Americans, had nothing else of value to offer them, so that's all they wanted. Thus, along with the British, who were also importing opium to China, we could say we were the first global drug traffickers. As we hooked many Chinese in the southern region of Guangdong on opium, and so the image of the Celestials in robes smoking opium pipes in opium dens are thanks to Britain and America. The first Chinese to arrive in America were called sojourners. They were not intending to stay. Fanning out from the harbors to mine gold in California in the late 1840s, hence we get the term Gold Mountain. So if you've heard that term used before, it was the Chinese moniker for America because they believed that they would find gold and become rich. They were indebted to their recruiters for their passage to the United States and their room and board. And a sizable portion of their earnings was taken from each paycheck, and thus most never earned enough to return to China, where many had a wife and children. That they have often been called bachelors when they drifted into Chinatowns is thus a misconception. So we often hear that Chinatowns are bachelor communities, and yes, they were men, mostly men living there, but they also had wives in China who were not able to come over. By the time the Chinese entered the gold rush, white prospectors had already claimed much of the land and prohibited Chinese miners from setting up camp or purged them by violent means. Many of them found employment in completing the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, a transportation system that was to connect the East Coast with China, that is, to assist in an exchange of goods and people, the latter mostly Chinese laborers, when needed to work in America. So it was, in a sense, a very uneven exchange. The line would not have been completed without the help of Chinese immigrants, many of whom lost fingers and toes placing explosives in the Sierra Nevada mountains, creating tunnels for rails, or they perished in the explosions themselves. So I recommend that you read Maxine Hong Kingston's Chinamen for this narrativized history and the many laws surrounding Chinese in America at the time. So you may recognize this picture when the railroads east and west were finally joined by the Golden Spike in 1869 at Promontory Point in Utah. You can notice that the Chinese in this famous scene are not depicted. It is the men who did not necessarily put their labor into building the railroad who are depicted. So then the Chinese laborers drifted to large West Coast cities like San Francisco, into the very small Chinese communities already established a decade ago, and enlarged them. These were safe locations where they could speak their own language, practice their culture, find the food they enjoyed. Even though eventually many Chinatowns became tourist spots, and still are, hence those Chinese on Canada's Victoria Island created small alleyways that opened into courtyards in their Chinatown, the latter places where they could feel, for the most part, freed from prying alien eyes. So even though this looks like a regular-sized alleyway, it was actually very small. It was called Fantan Alley, unfortunately. And you would walk down the alley, you could see all of the different shops, and then it would open out into a courtyard, and that's where many of the Chinese Canadians would gather, and that would be far away from people who wouldn't be able to see them from the sidewalks. Between 1860 and 1870, 30,000 Chinese lived on the West Coast. making up 4/5 of the workforce. And this was according to PBS's documentary called The Chinese Exclusion Act. And I would definitely encourage you to watch that if you haven't already. Because they often agreed to work for lower wages than their white counterparts, and out of necessity took jobs that many non-Chinese found feminizing: laundry work, being house boys, so to speak, dishwashing. Anti-Asian sentiment began to grow, and lynchings occurred in both Los Angeles in 1871. 19 Chinese were killed. In Wyoming, in the act of creating a Chinese union, a labor union, in 1885, 28 were killed. And then in 1886, over 12 California Chinatowns were deliberately burned down. So media representations of Asians in popular magazines of the time that were produced for a white middle-class reading audience, such as Harper's or Puck, would use these kinds of images. And you can easily find these images posted online, and they reflect the kind of attitude that people have 150 years ago, and you have to wonder, is that a kind of attitude that's coming back now when we hear about violence against Asians? So much anti-Asian sentiment grew among the white working class, led by Irish labor activist and immigrant himself, Dennis Kearney, that the first race-based law was passed in 1882. This was the Chinese Exclusion Act, deeming Chinese culturally unassimilable and barring them from citizenship. The act banned skilled and unskilled laborers from China, but it still allowed teachers, merchants, and diplomats to arrive. It was renewed 3 times until it was finally overturned in 1945. So I'm going to make a quick aside here to reference African Americans and Native Americans and their relation to Chinese labor. The politics of Jim Crow, the need for plantation laborers in the South, drove some Chinese there. As well, the extermination and removal of natives in the West converged with Chinese racism and exclusion. So here you have a history of removing people when they are inconvenient or unassimilable in the way of Western movement and settlement, and then the need for labor, right? So I'm thinking about capitalist structures. So in the South, as the former slaves were leaving, they needed people to take over those plantations, and so you had many of the Chinese going south. While the Exclusion Act reduced the number of incoming Chinese laborers, it also prevented Chinese immigrants from going home, if they could afford to do so, and returning. So they made their homes in Chinatown. When the California earthquake of 1906 caused a fire in Chinatown, burning all of the paper records of the Chinese patriarchs and the sons who had joined them, the Chinese saw this as an opportunity to cleverly adjust the legal wrongs committed against them, as they were still victims of the continued renewal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, by creating what are called paper sons, or kin on paper only, not by birth or blood. The Chinese here would falsely claim that a young male cousin or a nephew still in China was really their son, in an attempt to get them into the nation so they could work together in the States. They would also gain some money that way, because that particular family who had the so-called nephew or cousin would have to pay them to say that this is your son. So they would earn a little bit of money. So the West Coast, oops, another cartoon image. The West Coast-based immigration station, known as Angel Island, was the facility, like Ellis Island on the East Coast, that not only conducted physical examinations, but also interviewed these so-called incoming sons by asking a series of elaborate questions, attempting to root out the fictional paper kin. So they may get questions such as, how many windows do you have on the east side of your house? How many chickens do you own? And so father and so-called son were each interviewed separately to see about the accuracy of their replies. You know, were they really related or not? So there's an image of the interrogation. Some men and women were held on the island for a week, some for months, and even up to a year. 100,000 Chinese immigrants passed through the island between 1910 and 1940, when the facility was finally shuttered. The remnants of their confinement and longings are carved into the walls of the Angel Island Barrack. These characters were not discovered until the 1990s, as they were covered by layers of paint. And when I visited in 2002, the Park Service and local archivists were literally shining a light on the walls in ways that illuminated these poems. So if you want to learn more about the poems and what they say, their translations, and some of the archival work, I would suggest Mark Him Lai's Island, The Poetry and History of Chinese Immigrants on Angel Island. In 1937, with the Japanese occupation of Korea and China and the invasion of Nanking, China became our ally against the Japanese, which would continue throughout World War II. No surprise then that the Exclusion Act was officially lifted in 1943, and while quotas of Chinese immigrants were still small, they were allowed to be naturalized and to bring over their wives and families, finally allowing them the semblance of a family life through the 1945 War Brides Act. So this is a good place to define the notion of the yellow peril, or the idea that Chinese specifically, but also other Asians broadly, were regarded as filthy, disease-ridden, and unfit to consort or to marry and have children with white women. When a Chinese body was said to have succumbed to the bubonic plague in San Francisco's Chinatown in 1903, the Chinese were then also regarded as all diseased. The area was cordoned off, and all the white subjects were allowed to leave, while the Chinese, believed infected, were not given passage out. We know enough about infections from COVID-19 and contact tracing that those white visitors or residents could have just as easily carried the plague in and out of Chinatown. But they were allowed out, and the Chinese were the scapegoats. So we have media's visual contributions to creating the notion of monstrous Asians, someone like Fu Manchu, and that China has been the epicenter of many of the latest contagions. The bird flu, the swine flu, and now COVID-19 results in the violence against Asian Americans that we see today. But of course it has this longer history. The idea of the yellow peril as contagion and as an economic behemoth contributes to the notion of an Asian monstrosity. So this is an image by Lisa Choblon. It is, I think some of the violence against Asians today is resulting in this kind of artwork, and this is the cover to one of the latest Journal of Asian American Studies. This notion that I'm not a virus just because of my nationality. So now I'm going to jump to the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which lifted quotas on Chinese and many other immigrants at a time when the U.S. was sorely in need of those educated in medicine and research and development. Now we were eager for Chinese immigrants to assist in these endeavors. By that time, Asian American students, the second and third generations of their immigrant ancestors, were joining Black Americans and white and other women at San Francisco State University and Berkeley, protesting the lack of a curriculum and faculty that reflected the student body, something that we still struggle with today, I would say, in UNH, right? We had the Black student protest in 1998, and then we have students who are protesting to the president and the provost about, again, not having faculty of color, or they come and they leave, and where's the curriculum that talks about people who look like us? So images of Black Lives Matter rallies now appear when you search for these kinds of images, the ones behind me, on Google, as well as the name of Vincent Chin, who was senselessly killed by white men, as are many Black men being killed in the contemporary moment. So Renee Tajima Peña's 1987 film, Who Killed Vincent Chin, is a really great resource to find out about this particular person and what happened. Just a quick synopsis. Chin was a Chinese American who was mistaken for Japanese during the height of the car wars in Detroit. He was beaten to death by 2 white male auto workers, one a manager in a Chevy plant and his laid-off son, in 1982 on the eve of Chin's wedding. And both of the men were never spent a day in jail, and they paid a $3,000 fine. So again, you think about, all of the incidents between white police and black subjects and the kinds of results that have enraged the community. And now I'm going to go backwards to pick up a bit of history on Japanese immigrants who were recruited to work predominantly on Hawaiian sugar plantations. The plantation system itself pitted Asian strikers against other Asian laborers. So if the Chinese refused to work for the wages given, Japanese immigrants were brought in as strike breakers. And so it goes with Koreans. Originally, 7,000 came over, with 1,000 of them eventually returning to Korea and another 1,000 to the mainland. They claimed that they had been treated very badly on the plantations. And then the Filipinos. So after the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement that halted Japanese and Korean laborers, the Filipinos had American passports. So in 1910, they saw there was an increase in Hawaii from 4,000 Filipinos to 20,000 by 1925. So all of these ethnic rivalries that were occurring with, Filipinos coming in to be strike breakers for the Japanese, it made it seem as if the issue was driven by inter-ethnic rivalry and not the plantation system itself, which really wants to offer the lowest wages possible. So talking about those kind of capitalist structures and labor. We saw this occur as well during the LA riots when blacks looted Korean stores in a rage against systemic racism and not necessarily against Koreans per se. Many Japanese moved to the continent and became adept farmers, able to turn seemingly non-arable land into lush gardens. 2 major laws affected them in the early part of the 20th century. Again, the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement, in which Japan agreed not to issue any more passports to laborers, including those in Korea, which Japan had annexed from 1910 to 1945, and also the 1913 Alien Land Law, decreeing that subjects not eligible for citizenship were barred from owning land. Hence, the first-generation Japanese, called Issei, whose children were born in the U.S., placed those land rights in their successors' names. And I think this can bring us as well to the contemporary moment when we talk about issues of home equity that plague African Americans today, right? The inability to have houses and to pass down what we call generational wealth has really economically halted their growth into other areas of wealth acquisition. So if they don't have land, they don't have property, they have less equity, and that keeps them in a place that is less affluent than other non-blacks. As noted above, the Japanese were regarded with disdain after occupying Korea and after the seizure of Nanking. But when China became communist in 1949, and at this point the Japanese and Germans had lost World War II, the American tide turned again, this time against the Japanese. So you also see that the political tide is turning depending on what's going on in the countries. So South Asians from the Punjab region of India were pushed out of their home country by land dispossession, rising taxes in Jalandhar, Amritsar, Gurdaspur. No research, and there's really no research on why it is this particular area that sent so many of the South Asian subjects into Canada, where that was their first destination, and eventually into the United States. So they came to Canada in the early years of the 20th century to help with the railroads and to compensate the loss of Chinese laborers because of the Canadian $500 head tax on Chinese immigrants, which was a lot of money at that time. Canada derogatorily viewed South Asians as the turban tide of fixed regulations that pushed them toward immigrating to the U.S. For example, they needed to have 200 Canadian dollars on their person upon landing in Canada, and they could only arrive by continuous journey, which was nearly impossible because many of the ships docked in Hong Kong before coming to Canada, so that would make them ineligible to step onto Canadian soil. So the South Asians would then cross the border into America to work in lumber mills, but they faced hostility on the West Coast. 200, what they were called at the time, Hindus, were driven out of Bellingham, Washington, and then exclusion barring all Asians arrived with the 1917 barred zone. And then I'm thinking about the recent violence against Sikhs in April of this year in Indianapolis. So just that kind of circuit or cycle of racism. I'm returning to my historical timeline now to pick up Japanese-American internment during World War II. After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 2nd, 1941, the United States feared that the Japanese living on the West Coast might become spies for Japan. So they were deemed enemy aliens. And Executive Order 9066 legalized the evacuation of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, first to relocation centers and then internment camps. That some of them were as close as those in California and others were as far away as Arkansas. And you can see that this sign, like the one, I'm not a virus, are kind of channeling those same kinds of sentiments, that I belong here, I am an American. So in hastily built barracks, or sometimes in repurposed horse and other animal barns that still smelled of dung, Japanese Americans who had been successful in fishing and farming lost their equipment, their boats, their land, their houses, their possessions, and moved into locations that were hot deserts in the summer or frozen tundras in the winter. They battled mud, wind, and blowing sand, latrines without privacy doors, an atrocious discovery for the very modest Japanese women, unfamiliar food in the canteens that contributed to digestive problems, and chiggers in their straw beds. Family structure fell apart, and the loyalty questionnaire often divided them further. Two questions were key. Are you willing to fight for the United States if asked? And will you renounce your allegiance to the emperor? So the citizens who are unlawfully interned are now asked to relinquish ties to a country, Japan, where they once hailed, and fight for another, the U.S., that currently imprisons them. So you see all these kinds of layers of irony and the anger that affected so many of those who were interned. And also we have to note that the 442nd All-Japanese Regiment was the most decorated during World War II. When the camps were shut down after the war, some had nowhere to go, others returned to intense discrimination on the West Coast, and some of them moved east. So it was in 1976 that a New York Times Magazine article used the term model minority to speak of Asians and Asian Americans as successful minorities, especially Japanese Americans who had done so well after internment. It may seem like a good kind of typing in contrast to many other more negative views appended to Asian immigrants, but it pit Black Americans against Asian Americans, and the label model minority began to attach itself to other later refugees from the Vietnam War and from adjacent countries to Vietnam that had collapsed in the 70s and the 80s because of the war. So Hmong refugees from Laos who had helped the US during the secret war in Laos, Vietnamese, so-called boat people coming from refugee camps in Thailand and Malaysia. They did not speak English, Many were not educated, nor did they have the means to support themselves in the United States. And many did not want to come here, but given their association with America during the war, had nowhere else to go. So when they too are regarded as model minorities, the designation does a disservice. It assumes that they can help themselves because they're model Asians, and it deprives them of the closer look and help that they need upon arrival and even after. So we need not look so far afield to find the rich history of Asian Americans in New England. And I'm not doing this as a plug for my collection, but I'm doing this by a way of conclusion to end here with my collection called Asian Americans in New England, and give you a couple of some of the content from some of the chapters so you can see what a rich history we have right here in the New England region. So for example, there's a discussion in one of the chapters about the large Lao community that we have here in Newmarket. There's a discussion of Jung, who is the first Chinese to graduate from an American university, Yale, in 1854, and he brings over 120 Chinese youth to Connecticut. So he is involved in educating them here and then having them return to China to bring some of what they learned to China. And then there's a following chapter that talks about the Foreign Mission School in Cornwall, Connecticut. So this was part of that Foreign Mission project. And one of a historian found a friendship album that was written by one of these Chinese students, and she talks about that in her chapter, and it's really quite interesting, some of the experiences he had while in Connecticut. New Englanders' first glimpse of Japanese citizens through McGuire's Imperial Japanese Troop, which was touring the East in 1867 and made one of its first landings under the Big Tent in Worcester, Massachusetts. And then finally, the departments of Chinese and Japanese art in the Museum of Fine Art in Boston are a result of the politics of collection in the 19th century, or how industrialization and mechanization of New England in the late 19th century produced a depletion of spirit among New Englanders, who turned to the so-called exotic East to find fulfillment, specifically in the collection of Chinese art. So the names of William Sturgis Bigelow and Ernest Fenollosa, those are the collectors who wanted to bring this, so-called mystical spirit of the East to the West, and that's how we get our collection at the MFA. We also may be cognizant of the large Indonesian American community in Somersworth. They have a little Indonesia, which is supposed to be opening as soon as, we can walk around without masks and eat and enjoy some of their shops. And recently, I have been acquainted with Barbara Rimkunis, who is a co-executive director in the Exeter Historical Society, and she is interviewing the last Chinese laundryman in New Hampshire. I didn't know there were Chinese laundrymen in New Hampshire. So I thought that was fascinating, and she has been able to digitize a lot of her work. So if my students were interested in doing work and couldn't actually go to the archives, the librarians have been very good about digitizing it, so the students in my courses can read the material. So that, kind of a strangely crooked road to talking about all the different Asian immigration to the United States, and what is model minority, what is yellow peril, how do all of these things fit together. So I'm hoping that some of that picture is a little bit clear for you. And I would now like to introduce our next speaker among my many notes here. So the person who has done this beautiful poster, her name is Hannah Jung, and she is graduating from Oyster River High School and going to the Rhode Island School of Design, affectionately known as RISD, so congratulations to her. She won a contest in the 7th grade, the Doodle for Google contest. She was a state finalist, and she used glitter, sequins, and fabric to focus on some kind of fashion in her image for Google. And what she does is interpret her life experiences through her work. And I was reading an article about her in Mouth of the River, and I see that she's selling her work on Etsy, so I'll give her a little shout out there. So, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful introduction. My name is Hannah, as Monica just introduced me as. I'm a senior, and I'm here to talk about this piece, which is called Foreign, and it's part of a collection of works based on the theme of belonging. So this one is about one part of my identity, which is as a Korean American. So I'll go into a little bit of history about my culture, I guess. So I grew up in Indiana, and I was lucky enough to grow up in a small neighborhood with a lot of Korean families. And so I grew up with the Korean culture, and I grew up speaking Korean, and it was a really big part of my identity. I moved to Boston later, and that also had a really large immigrant population. And so being Korean and being Asian was kind of just a given part of who I was. And then in 5th grade, I moved to New Hampshire. And that was where I kind of first started feeling a conflict with my identity as an Asian American. And suddenly my identity as an Asian American became something that was different and unique, and something that I felt like I had to kind of put away to fit in. And so this piece is kind of about that conflict that I felt, to struggle to find like a place to belong. The title kind of refers to how I felt that I was seen as foreign in the context of being not American enough and then not Korean enough to be seen as fully Korean. And yeah, I wanted to use this art to kind of express that really subtle and like complex feeling of in-betweenness that's hard to put into words. To explain the piece a little more, that is me in the center, and the background is a Korean cityscape drawn in a different color to isolate the figure, and there are English and Korean characters kind of floating around, and I wanted it to portray kind of this like chaos and confusion regarding like my identity. Yeah, thank you.
That was incredible, Hannah. Thank you. And also one more round of applause for Monica. That was tremendous. There will be an opportunity for questions and discussion later. I realize we didn't give you the agenda for the night, which is to sort of go from the history to the current moment. And as Young Ho will describe, we'll be hearing from 4 more speakers, and then there'll be a chance for questions, discussions. So when you have ideas and affirmations and questions, I'll hold them to the end, and I hope that we can have a really robust discussion at that point.
So now we have heard Asian American history nationally and regionally, and we also introduced to our future by look into our future by introduce our future thoughtful star of Hannah, who is going to leave the Oyster River nest and fly. But what exactly does that mean for our community? So tonight we are very honored to have parent speakers here who is going to share their wonderful experience and stories. Please listen carefully with your heart and ears, and receive your question towards the end for them, and also for Monica as well as for Hannah. So please welcome our parent speakers, Sandy Chen and Carrie, and Sunny Sandana and Smita. So,
hi folks, how's this? So my name is Sandy Chin. My husband Matt and I live in Madbury with our 2 children, Sean, who's in the 10th grade, Caitlin, who's in the 8th grade. We moved here 13 years ago for a better work-life balance. So my parents were illegal immigrants. My father came to America in 1955 as a paper son. So his aunt, already living in the States, sponsored him as her son. So he had to change his last name and his year of birth because he was born too close to his aunt's son. So I was born and raised in New York City, and unfortunately, I'm not a stranger to racism, both being a recipient of racism, as well as my family perpetuating racism. So moving to New Hampshire, it's a pretty homogeneous state. No surprise, I've encountered my share of stupid remarks. On Main Street in Durham, I was hollered at to go back to my country. This is my country. I know no other country. I've never lived anywhere else. I've had a patient say to me that he needed a translator for my accent, my New York City accent. You want to give me a hot dog and a cup of coffee? I don't know. But I've also experienced it at the middle school. So several years ago, I was running past the school, and a student tried to get my attention by, saying some things that were inappropriate and mocking. So the first time I ignored it, second time ignored it, the third time I thought, I can't let this go. My kids are going to be students at this school. If I let it go, it is giving this student permission to continue to make these ignorant remarks. So I went and spoke to Mr. Sullivan, and he was great. He, in no uncertain terms, said this is behavior and language that is not condoned by the middle school. And he took care of it, and I appreciated that. But we can do better. We can definitely do better. There's a sense that Asians are not American. No matter how many years we've been here, no matter how many generations we've lived here, you can pick us out in a crowd. We don't phenotypically look like a Caucasian American, so it's easy to pick on us and to scapegoat us. We're not taught that we have been in America since the 1800s. We're not taught about the sacrifices that our fellow Asian Americans have made in war and in industry. We just learned, I didn't learn until I was in college about the all-Japanese American regiment that fought the Nazis, all while their families were being interned and their property taken away from them. If we don't learn about our history, it's going to repeat itself. Asian Americans will continue to be scapegoated. It's happened before, it's going to happen again. It happens during times of economic depression, it happens during times of war, and it's happening now during a pandemic. The rise in anti-Asian American violence has skyrocketed. Asian Americans are not responsible for the coronavirus, but we're being blamed for it. So this is my history, but it's also your history, because it's American history.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. And I wanted to make sure I said thank you to both Dr. Morris and to UC as well for providing this opportunity and a safe space to have this conversation. So my name is Carrie Neal, and I'm a school board member in Barrington, which is luckily how Oyster River has many of our amazing students here, and we have this great relationship, and so I appreciate this opportunity. I don't have any students here yet of my kids, but pretty soon. My oldest is a 7th grader. And so my brief history is that I was born in South Korea, and I was adopted to a white family. I have 2 older brothers who are biological to my adoptive parents. And I'm married to a white man. I have 3 beautiful biracial children. And I have lived and grown up in New Hampshire specifically ever since. And so that was in 1987. So I've been here what I would consider all of my life for the most part. And then growing up, I experienced a lot of identity confusion. So I would remember closing my eyes in front of a mirror, and to me, I was white. I really identified as white. But I knew logically I didn't look white. And so trying to figure out that balance was really complicated enough in an age of middle school and high school where all you want to do is just fit in for the most part. And then even being adopted became quite a stigma. There weren't a lot of adopted children back when I was growing up in elementary school and in high school, and so there were a lot of jokes about siblings. You're the adopted one, as if there was that negativity there, or people making jokes about not being wanted or being an accident. And as a child, you don't really understand how deeply the meaning is behind it, but you know enough to know that it's not great. And so all of a sudden being adopted equaled something that was bad, and I just didn't want to talk about it. But it makes it hard to not talk about it when you go to restaurants and you look different than your family, and you can tell people are kind of trying to figure out how this relationship works. Even waitresses and waiters would ask questions. I was always one of my brother's girlfriends because I obviously couldn't be part of that family. And then people around me, even people who I would consider friends, and even sometimes really well-meaning, close family members, didn't quite understand what I was going through or even how to really react to it. And so I want to explain that some of these incidences that I'm describing were incredibly innocent and well-meaning. And to me, that does matter. That's why we're here, is to educate and to learn and to talk about it. And so, for example, similar, I hear all the time still as an adult, I have such a great American accent. I don't quite know what that means because to me, I've been all across the country. There are many accents in America, but apparently I have a really great one. I was once asked if I could help a friend take care of their bamboo plant because I must know how to do that. I've been asked if I'm a communist. That was not more than a year ago. Or it's assumed that I must be very good at math and science. That's a given, which I don't think I'd put my money on that. So, and then just as many comments are said innocently, there are many more that are said without a doubt and not up to interpretation as not innocently. So I've been called every racial slur imaginable. I've had when I was growing up, I had kids pulling at the corner of their eyes at me. And then more recently as an adult, I had garbage thrown at me on the side of the road. I was waiting for my daughter to get off the bus, and I was called a racial slur and yelled at to go back to where I came from. And then I forgot. And then sometimes this odd thing in, I think, more pop culture, American culture, is that Asian women tend to be hypersexualized, thinking of geishas and things like that. And then most recently at the last school board meeting, there was a comment made that was racist in intent. And it brought some of these feelings that I've experienced to the surface. And truly as an adult, I've really gotten callous to some of them. They've become part of just things I deal with. I often even make jokes about it with people that I know I think probably more to control the conversation. It's just easier to laugh about it because other people seem more uncomfortable with it than I do. But then it happens to your kids, and then it becomes really, really hard to ignore. So my daughter's in middle school, my oldest. She gave me permission to discuss this, but this was only one instance that I was given permission to out of all 3 of my children who have experienced something happen to them. She had 2 notes left in her backpack blaming her for bringing COVID to the school. And that was just a month ago. So before, I know UC was very clear, we have 5 minutes. She was so good about that. I just want to make sure people know I'm not sharing my story, and I don't think any of us are, because we're trying to stir the pot or create unnecessary division, even though our stories are both similar and different. It's just, in reality, it's the necessary and critical first step in healing the divisions that really already existed, but perhaps you might not have realized it because we don't always talk about it. It's to share experiences with those who might not ever be in this position, because there's this ongoing problem that unless it happens to you, it doesn't exist. And so I'm often told when I do share experiences, why I've learned not to is that I get told to relax, calm down, take a joke, ignore it, get over it. And when you hear those things enough in face of feeling targeted, you just learn to stop talking about it. And I just hope to close out that while this is a great first step, and I'm so appreciative, this, just like Black Lives Matter movement, just like LGBTQ plus Awareness Month, they can't just be months, they can't just be movements. They have to be something that we're constantly discussing and bringing up, getting uncomfortable about, and being okay with being comfortable about it. And that means for those that might be targeted and those who want to learn more about it too, because I've found that things don't get better just because we ignore them. And we have to get away from that concept of if you ignore the problem, it will go away, because it won't. And so thank you all for taking the first step, and for listening and for being part of this discussion.
All right, my name is Sunpreet Singh Sidana. I see a lot of people in the audience I know because I've either taught your children, you're one of my neighbors in town, you've been in teacher meetings with me, and so on. I don't think I've ever opened myself up like this in a public forum with this many people who I've already hung out with in some weird way, but I'm ready to. So, when I walk these lands here in the United States, the first thing I think of when somebody sees me is that I am an immigrant, right? They don't really know where to necessarily put me in that slot. That's kind of been the name of my game. When I talk to some friends of mine, they obviously say, "You're an American." And I'm like, "Yeah, I am an American." But when I fill out those darn bubbles, those bubbles you gotta fill out, I'm an Asian American. And I'm like, that's pretty vast. And when I talk to my close friends, they're like, "You're not Asian American, you're Asian Indian American." And I'm like, "Yeah," but then I talk to my parents, and they're like, "Not Asian Indian American, you're a Sikh American." And then I talk to my relatives overseas, and they're like, "You're not a Sikh American, you are Peshori. You are Peshori Sikh American." So what is Peshawar? Peshawar is a part of what is now Pakistan. It wasn't always Pakistan, it used to be a part of India. And that's where my grandparents lived on both my mom's side and my dad's side. But because of the wars in the 1940s, they were displaced, and they had to leave everything they had behind. And mom's side went to the northwestern region of Punjab, and dad's side went to Assam, northeastern region, and they got an arranged marriage. But the grandparents, they didn't get past 5th grade educations. They just didn't have the best life, but they believed that every common thread between 2 totally different families was that they believed in education. They believed the only way their kids could get out of the mess of this country that was forming was to get a solid education. So dad, aunts, everybody went to college. Dad got a scholarship to become a doctor. And that, with a passion of American music and Elvis Presley, immigrated my dad and my mom in their early to our late 20s, with a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old in tow, to Bensonhurst, New York, so Brooklyn. So I immigrated. I was born in Assam, and I immigrated at the age of 3. We lived in Brooklyn for a while. My dad did his residency out there and a fellowship as well. And we hopped around. We eventually ended up leaving because when we were there and I was going through the public school systems, I had probably gone through a few sort of hate microaggression crimes, but I think and my dad had as well. Keep in mind, one thing I should have prefaced is I grew up in a world of turbans and saris until I came to the United States. My entire family out in India wears turbans, all the males do. And the second my dad came out here, he was a victim of enough just hate in the hospitals that he cut his own hair, something that was associated with his identity and pride of his entire life. And my mom also trying to adjust to that sort of new reality. So the straw that broke the camel's back was when Grandma came to visit and was in her clothes and walking me from the bus into, let's say, teenage kids in Brooklyn just threw her down, just like you hear about the elderly Asian woman that got thrown down in San Francisco and all those sorts of things. So I was a victim of that with my eyes. That was like first grade. Okay, so you can imagine what that makes a first grader feel like. And then later on, a few years later, we immigrated. It kind of feels like immigrated. We moved to Southern California. Okay. And we went to a town called Claremont. It's a small little college town. It's got a pretty well-known colleges out there, and I felt very fortunate to move out there. We moved there because Dad got a position in a community hospital in Pomona, California, which was at one point murder capital of Southern California because of the gang violence out there. But it was a good job. So he took it, and I went into a school where the Southern California melting pot was vast and around. There was definitely some Indian people. There was definitely a lot of Latinx and every single sort of culture you could perceive of, but there was nobody that was really you. Like I didn't find another Sikh sort of American, any sort of Peshawari person. I found an Indian friend, actually my best friend, one of them, was Indian, and he's darker than I am. We don't speak the same language. He's from the South. He's vegetarian. I like to eat my meat. And we had celebrated different holidays, yet when we were grouped up together, we were always called brothers. Didn't matter, he was like 10 shades darker than me. Okay, got way better tan than I did. And then in the middle years of middle school and then into high school, when you finally played the Plinko board of life and you tried to get that social clique that you're hanging out with, that was tough. That was really tough. So my best friends growing up, one of them is black, the other one is Sri Lankan, the other one is Lebanese. There's 4 of us. 2 of them dropped out of the university, or dropped out of their high school, and now we're both PhDs, go figure. And that kind of brings me fast forward to what happens later in life, right? So then I'm in my mid-20s, and we go through this thing called 9/11. 9/11, I was visiting my friend, my cousin in Wisconsin. I was supposed to fly back that week, and the world kind of flipped on us, right? And being a brown person that can't be really defined in what culture, I got profiled so many times. I was wearing shorts, flip-flops, and gym shorts, flip-flops, and a t-shirt, flying back from Wisconsin to Los Angeles. They thought I was a Colombian drug dealer. I got profiled twice there, 2 separate occasions. Second time they thought I was an Arab who was planning something pretty bad to happen. Irony of Sikh Americans, or the Sikh culture and Arab culture, it's a dark one, but there's a bad clash there. So anyways, I'm gonna move on a little bit. Finally, what brings me to New Hampshire? So after all that crazy life I had, I finally decided I need to go in the woods and escape and work with kids in the mountains. So I started working in environmental education in New England on a total whim. Eventually that trickled down to graduate school. I met my wife there at UNH, had some awesome professors, an incredible internship at the middle school, and so on. My wife's a Mainer, her anchor's deep. She's kept us here for a little while. And I'm really happy. I have a 5-year-old who will be joining Mehermet in the fall, a 7-year-old who is had her first grade year. And I guess I'll end with this one. So my 7-year-old was coloring a family picture the other day, pretty recently, and she made all 4 of us, in line and started shading in things. And I saw the picture. She was so excited to see it. And my wife was yellow, shaded, Ian, my son, was yellow shaded, Jade was yellow shaded, and Dad is dark brown. And I was like, how am I supposed to take that one? And I guess as I bring this out into the open, I just hope when Jade's my age, she has the right bubble to fill. So I'll leave it with that. Thanks.
Hi. Well, if I don't hurry up, we won't have any time for questions. So I'm going to race through just a few things that I want to say about myself. So I'm here as a mother. I'm here as a person of Asian origins. And I'm also here as an anthropologist, not in my professional capacity. I'm not going to take any notes about anything, but as an existential anthropologist. And what I mean by that is I'm here as someone who pretty much in any place that they find themselves, in any setting, it feels both an insider and an outsider. And I'm actually pretty reconciled to that. So I think that that's not as common as it could be, maybe it should be, even in this very, very diverse country of ours. So let me just tell you a bit about why I think, or how that came, what I mean by that. So I've lived in America most of my life, even though you might not think so from the way I speak. But my parents are Indian, and they raised my sister and me in places all around the world, wherever my father, who had a diplomatic job, was assigned. And my sense of self was shaped in many different Asian cities. And in all of them, I was kind of an insider, but also an outsider, didn't quite fit, right? So I was the kid in New Delhi who seemed unremarkable, but whose English was suspiciously a lot better than her Hindi. I was also the kid in Dhaka, Bangladesh, who was clearly clueless about Islam, but whose mornings and evenings were kind of punctuated by the sound of the azan, the muezzin call, which I still can hear in my head. And in the Philippines, where I spent time as well, in one way I was, I was the kid who ate fish and rice in the Catholic school cafeteria like any Filipino kid. But I was also excused from Bible study and Mass, even though I would sneak in, because who wants to be the one who isn't at Mass, with the hymns, the flowers, and the scents, and so forth. So then my American journey from sojourner, to use Monica's language, to citizen really began in the late 1980s when my father was assigned or posted to the Indian consulate in Chicago. And I was posted to a public high school in what was still at the time one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And I got a crash course in the American racial system. And it took me a while to realize the strangeness of it, to realize that perhaps for the first time ever, I was a person of color. The other thing that I realized is that I was in a world where there are really two strong signals, those of whiteness and those of blackness, and everything else, whatever kind of brown or difference you might be, if you're not assigned to one of those signals, you're just noise. I mean, you could be interesting noise, you could be decorative noise. I mean, you could be, but in a sense, people don't have a place, a sense of you and your belonging in, because that's assigned to those two poles, those two really strong signals. That was my experience anyway, and it seemed very unique at the time. I didn't think that there was anything typical about my experience, but in retrospect, there was, because I think that sense of being confined to a residual category that can be associated with, good qualities and acceptance and just being like everyone else, but also being, on the other hand, somewhat strange and problematic. I think that is the situation. That is this long-standing, maybe centuries-old residual place that Asian Americans have been forced to occupy in the American national imaginary. So, as I said, I didn't think that my experience was typical, and in many cases it wasn't. I mean, I didn't know any other people who were chauffeur-driven in a Lincoln town car with diplomatic plates and then dropped off a block away from their inner city public high school. But when I think about it, there really were some ways in which this actually was pretty. The place I entered when I walked inside was something of a microcosm of the American racial system that I was learning about. So the school I went to was 70% Black in its student body, 20% white, and 10% all kinds of others, right? But I tested into and was placed in the magnet program there. And who was in the magnet program? Well, it was the mirror image. It was about 7 out of 10 kids would be white, and the rest would basically be one of those residual others, Asians or Arab Americans, and there were very few Black students and very few Native Americans. It was kind of astonishing to me how what a kind of strange mirror this was of all the different kinds of structural forces in American society. Well, let me just fast forward and say we moved to New Hampshire. My husband, who's here and who's an exotic guy from Nebraska, and I came here with our older daughter, and our younger daughter was born here. And oddly enough, I feel that I have been coming to terms with that sense of being seen and not seen, being noise, but also signal, not so much in my own experience, but really in the experience of my children, who really, if you looked at them because of their mixture of ancestry, they probably would go without mention in half the countries of the world. They're kind of indeterminate looking. They could be white, they could be Hispanic, they could be all kinds of things. And yet, my youngest daughter has experienced repeated instances over the last few years where children, her peers, and it's not to blame them as individuals at all, have done things like they've walked up to her and said, "You're the brown kid. I don't like brown. And are you even American?" Or there was the time when the students were reading about civil rights and the life of Martin Luther King and segregation, and one of my daughter's friends says, "Wait, so would she have to go to the Black school if we were living in those days?" Which kind of boggled my mind. It seemed so odd on so many levels. But I think what I'm trying to figure out, what I'm discovering or feeling is that this is not so much one could call this microaggressions in the young, but one could also say that this is the result of young people trying desperately to fit a complicated world into one of two signals. And I think it speaks to the very long and heavy weight of racialized thinking, and I feel sorry. I feel sorry that my daughters have to experience everything that goes on with that, but I also feel sorry for everybody who spends so much of their life is caught up in trying to make this system, this meaningless system, have meaning. And I don't have any solutions, obviously, but I think that whatever it is, it's going to have to come. It's going to involve a place where there is no provisional, there is no residual, where everybody belongs, where structural and historical differences are acknowledged and talked about, but where that sense of having to tune into one or two signals isn't so strong, and people are more comfortable being insiders and outsiders in one situation or another as they move through their worlds. And I'm here to tell you that that's actually perfectly fine. It's a fine way to be. It's a fine place to be. Thanks.
Wow. We just went on 200 years, over 200 years of history. Looked at this through the lens of art, a different part of the brain, and then heard really 4 powerful stories, all diverse, different from each other. There's diversity within the diversity, and yet so many similar themes too. And so I would invite everyone, before we get into the discussion, for those who can stay, to just spend a moment, maybe put your hand on your heart, breathe, think about something that you heard, that surprised you, that shocked you, that inspired you, maybe an action that you'll take away, and just think about that for a sec, of everything that you've heard tonight already. It is 7:30 in a busy May evening. However, I invite those who can stay another 15 minutes to engage in discussion, and then for those who want to stay after that, but we'll have a break at 7:45 as well. I invite folks to reflect on what you've heard, to ask questions of all of our panelists. I invite you to, if you see that there is someone of Asian heritage who is gunning for the microphone, to stand back, to let them be visible and let their voice be heard. But that's not to not be welcoming to others. Just step back a little first, and let's see where this evening goes. But first, if you do need to leave, no harm, no foul. Thank you for coming. See everyone here, still here, awesome. Oh, there, of course, it always happens, you sit the furthest away of the entire. Would anyone like to come speak? There's a microphone here, a microphone here. I think it's a pretty, Kelly, feel free to come down if you'd like. It's a affirming crowd, but I just do feel the need to say that we are respectful. We're here to learn. We're here to listen. If you have a question, it could be a pointed question possibly, but keep it as a question. Or if you wish to share your own experience, that is absolutely welcome in this discussion as well. Lauren, please.
Oh, I'm Lauren. I live here in Durham, and I just want to first say thank you so much for sharing your stories. And as someone who grew up in the 70s and 80s, and my experiences are not relevant for this evening, but I want to apologize for absorbing the cultural norms that made making negative comments about people who are Asian specifically part of the culture. And I want to take ownership for my own actions as a child and a teenager and tell you how deeply sorry I am for the actions I took then. And please know that my commitment to myself and to my children and to the future is to make it all much better. I also want to thank Dr. Morse and the DEI and the school board for welcoming such a wonderful opportunity for us to really learn about so many other experiences, because I know that not everyone in our community is as open to hearing things, and I apologize for them too, but thank you.
Can you hear? Oh, yes, you can hear me. Hi, my name is Kelly Brandt. I've been on both sides of this because I lived and worked in Beijing, China for about 17 years, and then we came here. I'll keep it brief. Enrolling my eldest son here, Oyster River High School, was probably the single worst decision I made on his behalf. He is damaged because of what happened here. Contrary to expectations, the ESL program was an utter disaster. Now, I point out, not the teacher. The teacher was fine. The problem was the materials that were provided, the time that was provided. My son went from a 100% Chinese situation to 100% English. And so he would go to class, and teachers later would look at me and say, it's as if he doesn't understand what I'm saying. And I would tell them, he doesn't. He
Kelly,
can't understand it.
I'm so glad that you're sharing this. I know this story. I should have mentioned it's a 3-minute.
Okay, so anyhow, he suffered because he's Asian, he's half Asian. My wife is Chinese. He suffered over racism from the basketball coach here. And then we had a daughter who did a little bit better because she came into middle school. She was very lucky. She had a couple of teachers. Ms. Tregay was instrumental in turning her around. Paula Roy did a great job in intervening on her behalf. But ultimately, she never felt like she belonged here. Ultimately, she grew tired of hearing her friends ridiculed, watching what was happening to her brother. So she went to Phillips Exeter because she felt her ethos was a little bit more welcoming. My question here is, on May 17th, 4 years ago, I went to go see Jim Morse about this, and I raised these questions with him. They were never answered. The investigation was squashed. My question to you is, why, 4 years later, are we only beginning to address the issues that I raised? Why is it that it seems to me that we are behind? We're always trying to catch up. We only react when something happens. We need to get out in front. And so that's why I'm glad we have this going on, but I think that we need to have some leadership that can move us forward and not just be reactive. Thank you so much for your time.
I'm curious about the panel. This question of why now. I adjusted at the podium, so did Yang Hong. Some of you have talked about it, but any further thoughts on inspired by Kelly's comment of the urgency or the why now question?
I can add 2 cents to that one. Oak Creek, Wisconsin, about 5 years ago, maybe at this point, shooting in a Sikh temple. Pretty horrific, really bad. George Floyd 1 year ago. Okay, and then there's a countless amount, right? So why now? Why is it elevated now? I think you gotta point fingers at some of our media. I think you gotta point fingers at where society is finally progressing and things that are finally giving attention to. I mean, when I was a middle schooler, and I see some middle schoolers I teach and I've taught before here, when my family came from India, when they would wear turbans, I was terrified to take them out. Terrified. God forbid one of my friends would see my cousin who had a turban, because then they would know who I was, where I was from. They could call me great names, and I have a lot of them. My God, I've been called everything and then some. I don't think that would happen as much or be tolerated as much now. I think things are way, way better. And so I just think, why are we addressing these things now? Thank God we are. Finally, we're getting there. For those of us that have been living through this for a very long time, we see progress, but we don't, the goal is still way ahead. It's way over there.
I think part of why now is because we're we're all realizing as a society that we all deserve to belong. We all deserve the same unquestioned sense of being able to breathe and occupy space. I mean, for so long, partly it's happening because of George Floyd, but it's also happening, it's happening, I think, because we're seeing that it's all linked, right? That when Asian kids are laughed at or Asian elders are knocked down, it's not separate from the world in which Black kids are structurally disadvantaged and Black men are shot for their sole existence in white space. We're seeing the belonging of dreamers questioned constantly. And I just think people have had enough. They're seeing all these struggles as linked. And I think that's a really positive thing.
I think there's the backlash on the pendulum swing, right? When there were equal rights and it's against the law to discriminate. And many of us were the generation where we were taught to be colorblind. And I think that period, sort of that vision is clearly fracturing. So we tried that, and there are still these structural aspects that are rearing their heads.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's been really amazing. I have a practical question because we are all so busy, and yet we want to be vigilant about maybe pendulum swings that might be trying to limit the broad-minded education that I'm hoping that my children will get. And if there is any forum that can let parents know when there's bills coming up in the State House, because we know education is local, that might be trying to limit curriculum that's fact-based and broad-based and human race-based, I'd like to know, because there's just too much out there in the media, to sort of have something that's like a resource where parents can go or be alerted, there's a bill coming up for this, because we see it in other places and I don't want it to happen here. Thank you.
Just on that, the Committee on Equity and Anti-Racism is thinking more intentionally about social media and ways to alert and also equip and mobilize within our community these types of opportunities.
I'll just, is this on? Can you hear me? Oh. So I'm part of the New Hampshire Racial Unity Team, and we're putting together a panel kind of similar to this, where we'll have some professors from the university talking about when do kids start noticing race, realizing race? When do you start talking to your kids about race? What do you say to them? I think a lot of parents have questions about how am I supposed to talk to my kids about race? So we were going to have this on June 19th, but that's Juneteenth, and that's not a good day to have that discussion because we're talking specifically about Asian and Asian American students. But I don't know where I could get that information so that Oyster River parents could see it. I could talk to UC about that.
Another bridge in the interim until we have that in Oyster River is the Kent Street Coalition on Facebook. Kent Street Coalition has a lot of information on how the HB 544 divisive concepts language is making its way through various bills, as well as opportunities to get involved through testifying, showing up at rallies, that sort of thing. For those of Asian heritage, also the New Hampshire AAPI Democrats is another private group that has even more focus on AAPI specific legislation and topics, but is also closely connected with that Kent Street Coalition group.
I just add one thing real quick. I really want to thank everybody that's here. I did not expect this many people and colleagues and whatnot. I just feel really fortunate in the area that we live in, and I can't be more proud to send my kids to this school system. I really can't. Just how this sort of organically transformed and happened, and hear people's stories. And I know you're my neighbors as well as my students and my parents that I work with and colleagues. So it's flattering to be in such an amazing place and have this. So thank you.
And do I have still time? Yes. Thank you, guys. Thank you for all for sharing your experience, especially from my point of view. I noticed that most of you are like born in the United States, grown up in the United States, so you're kind of a second generation of the Americans. Myself, I'm from China. I grew in China. So from my own experience, I like Durham very much. I personally don't feel a lot of like kind of racial pressure on me, on my family, but I'm not sure my children, because they are more like you guys, second generation. From your guys, definitely you have a different kind of sensitivity of this kind of problem. So as a parent, so I'm especially for parents like me, we were born in a different country. We grown up in this country. We don't have this kind of sensitivity. So from your point of view, if these kind of things happen to my children, to the second generation of Americans, what do you have any personal suggestion for to communicate with this with your parents and the children? For example, if you wish, when you had your bad experience when you're grown up, what did you wish your parents do at that time to help you a little bit, to guide you a little bit? This is from my point of view. I would like to to know more about. It's more helpful for my person, I think. Thank you.
I think maybe it's, learning what kinds of questions you can ask your children when they come home from school. Because I think a lot of times they might not want to talk about it because it's painful or they don't know how to talk about it. And this is not my area of expertise, and I think that's why I'm interested in the panel about how to talk to your kids about these issues of race, especially when they're young. But yeah, learning what kinds of questions to ask, giving them ways in which they can respond sometimes when things happen that don't, not violent response, but things that you can say, how maybe they could talk to their teachers. Those are the things that come to mind at the moment.
Something that helped me when I was growing up, and this is a very vulnerable thing to admit, but when things started really happening to me, that were very not innocent, was in middle school. And the very first thing that my parents did was they got me a really great therapist, because they knew I was not able to have that conversation with them, and truthfully, they did not feel equipped to have that conversation with me. And at the time, I was very resistant, as, no offense to the middle schoolers that are here, you can imagine that when your mom and dad tell you you should probably talk to a therapist about it, I was not pleased with that. But as an adult looking back on it, that was probably the best decision that my parents could have made, to provide not only someone who's trained in providing and listening and making a safe space for me to talk about things, they also had a great relationship with my parents and connected them with other groups. I mean, they weren't local, because New Hampshire, you have to drive pretty far to get from city to city, but other resources in cities that were a little bit larger, like Manchester and Concord, that could really help us at the time. And this was back in the 90s, so you can imagine there must be some better resources now. At least I hope that there are, and if they're not, then that's one of those things that we're learning here today, is if we go to research some of these things and they do not come up easily, that's a sign. But that's what I would suggest, because I don't think middle schoolers love running to their parents to tell them everything, so that might be a great option. And if not directly, they can get you in touch with the right contacts to be able to provide resources.
you're doing a great job, just, being cognizant of that potential conflict that your children may be going through. So my parents, we didn't really communicate. We were kind of feral. So, I growing up, I remember watching the Brady Bunch and going into the bathroom and taking baby powder and putting it in my hair and on my face so I would look more white. So I think, if I could have talked to my parents about that, they again were immigrant Chinese, and they were having trouble assimilating into the culture, period. So I'm not sure that I would have been able to talk to them freely about things, but it would have made a difference if they had asked, how was your day? How are your friends treating you? Do you have any, are you experiencing things that you want to talk about because you're Chinese and you're American? I mean, Hannah's painting, her conflict is there, and so I asked my kids, have you experienced racism? So it's a conversation that I think you just need to keep having with them, and the more you talk about it, I think the more comfortable you get with it.
I think sometimes it's hard to have these conversations directly, so indirect can, over a cultural experience. I hope you have had a chance to look at some of the books outside. There are some amazing, wonderful children's literature that brings up, it just sort of smuggles in all sorts of themes and conflicts and issues of the kinds we've been talking about, and those are great conversation starters. I think that, in our family, some of our best conversations have happened that way, over books and movies.
I want to put one teacher resource out there. This kind of goes to that whole picture of my daughter sketching. My daughter's biracial, my wife is white. So she was sketching the yellow, brown. And my mother-in-law, God bless her, after she heard the story, came over next day with a box of 50 different shades of brown, like the Crayola ones, And that was the perfect thing to sort of kind of begin that conversation. Like, you're a blend, and we're all a blend. And so those crayons are awesome. I wish I had them when I was a first grader.
Hi, everybody. Hi, I'm Shauna Coppola. And first of all, Hannah, what's your Etsy store called? Let's get that out there. Do you mind?
It's not for so this art is like for my portfolio and my college applications and stuff, but my Etsy, I do like family portraits, kind of like cartoon illustrated family portraits. It's called Hannah J Studios, no space, on Etsy. Okay. Thank you for asking.
You're welcome. I mean, I'm just enamored with your work. Thank you. I just also want to thank everybody here for being here tonight and for being vulnerable and sharing your stories, and for UC and Young Hung for doing this and organizing this, and it's just a wonderful first step. Dr. Morris, thank you for the opportunity. And I also wanted to let folks know that we're in the very early stages, but we do, as part of our equity and anti-racism work, we are starting to have some spaces on social media. We're trying to look beyond that, of course, for accessibility purposes. But if you are on Facebook or Instagram and you look up OR Equity Justice, you will start to find areas where we're trying to celebrate and amplify some of the work that's related to our mission to help with equity and anti-racism efforts. First, locally, we are going to expand that, but for now, we're there to let you know when there are events happening, programming like this happening. So we hope to expand all of that, but it's very new. And if anybody's interested in learning a little bit more about some of the things happening around here, that's where you can find some of that. And we're always open to folks letting us know as well, because it's a small volunteer group. So anything that you have for us, we'll post it. Thank you.
Tessa. Maybe the last question?
So I'm planning to graduate in a couple of weeks, and I actually started in this district in kindergarten. I actually had Mr. Sedana as my 5th grade teacher. And I was just wondering, this community, one thing that I've noticed has really prided it on itself and works to be not racist. But what we're kind of learning now is that not racist often means complicit, and it's often a fairy tale kind of to disguise our own kind of more deep-seated racism. And I was wondering if there were things that you thought either this district or community members or students or just individuals could be doing to be more anti-racist and to be more supportive of the Asian community, more supportive of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
No, I think if you see behavior from your peers or parents or people in the community, it takes a lot, but be brave and call it out. Oh, and things can be, it doesn't have to be bam in your face, bad crap racism. There is this kind of benign racism. You know, we talked about, oh, your accent, you don't have an accent, or your English, you speak English so good, English so well, thank you very much. You know,
You're not going to be getting many compliments with that.
I had someone say to me, and this was, you know, meant to be very complimentary, obviously, but it was, oh, I only go to Asian doctors because you people are so smart. I said, thanks. So, you know, it can be well-meaning, but when you hear that, speak up and say, hey, you know, what are your assumptions from that? Why do you think that all Asians are smart? Where does that come from? Well, the mild minority myth. Well, they don't know the mild minority, but you know, I appreciate that your eyes and your ears are open and you're trying to be an active advocate for marginalized people. So thank you.
Can I just add quickly, I so agree with what Sandy just said, and I think it's tricky with stereotypes because there's always some thread of truth in those stereotypes, right? And it could be something as simple, which many people don't know, like, yeah, there's a lot of Asian doctors because you know what? After 1965, when immigration laws were opened up, they only let in people who had medical and engineering degrees, right? It's not something genetic. It's like, it's actually a product of the U.S. immigration system. So, you know, there's, I think maybe confronting these stereotypes on our own and being able to address the nub of whatever it is that's in there that's making this perception persist can also be a good strategy, but it's not necessarily easy. And that's where I think being part of online communities, having resources is really helpful.
We'll
What
build
about,
off, I was
take-
just going to say, we'll build off of Tessa's question and maybe starting with you, Monica, some concluding thoughts and maybe one call to action.
Oh, well, I guess maybe my call to action then would be, you know, taking a deep dive into the curriculum in the high school, right? So what has just been a matter of standard course, and what can you add to it? You know, what can you take away? What can you add? And can we not, I think someone mentioned this before, you know, during Black History Month, that's not the only month that you're going to talk about and read books by and about Black people, and the same with Asian Americans. So thinking about the curriculum in a more intentional manner.
Absolutely. Popcorn style. Jump in, Carrie.
Oh, the classroom libraries too, and the libraries in not just my own districts. I know I don't have children in Oyster River yet, but in Oyster River as well, checking those classroom libraries, encouraging budgets and policies that support, making sure that it's well-rounded curriculum, and that the first book that a child reads that doesn't have a person that looks just only exactly like them can't be when they're later in life. It should be as young as pre-K and kindergarten. So I think that would be a great suggestion.
Call to action, yes. Oops, sorry. I guess the call to action, I have a couple things. One, kind of keep on doing what I do, which is get the chance to teach kids around here. I love that. I know I'm one of the very few people of color in the district that they get to see in regards to an adult in their life, other than their own parents, some of them. And you know, the anti-racist committee, the work the district has done, the leadership has done, they've really done some amazing things, and just to kind of encourage that. But now as I have my own little children in the primary schools, and they're gonna battle with their own racial identity, I'm actually gonna be looking for help from my teachers, my colleagues.
What an evening. To continue on the wedding theme, we are gathered here to hear some really deep stories, and as any of us who are married know, it's really just the start, and the hard work is ahead of us. And it's when the community comes together that that we can make hard things, we can do hard things, right? We can make big things happen. I have a ton of people to thank. Yang Hong, doorway to the Chinese immigrant community in particular, of which there are many for UNH, and so it's just been tremendous. Zai-Sheng also, thank you for staying. Dr. Morse, I'm in no particular order, Dr. Morse, for your leadership and just moral compass through asking all of these hard questions. Is Dan from Barrington still here as well? The superintendent from Barrington, Dan, thank you for your presence and partnership in all of this. When we think of the artists, certainly Hannah, and also the music, the sort of jazz music that was played as you were walking in was by John Jang, who is a Chinese-American jazz musician who is an activist in his music and in his partnerships. I think his latest piece was the Black Asian Anthem. So check out his work, it's really incredible. And then the book tables. Some of the families who came today brought our own material, so take a look, take pictures of what you wanted you might want to explore, but also librarians from all 4 buildings brought just a small selection of the materials that they have at all age ranges. We do a really fine job of that at Oyster River, so you know, summer reading is coming up. To our panelists who put so much of yourselves out today, thank you. Sandy Chin, Carrie Neal, Sunny Sadana, Smita Lahiri, blank because of the end of the evening, and Monica and Hannah, thank you so much. Finally, Alexander, who helped with the technology, the DEI Club, who's been supporting us tonight, and then just doing such great work at the high school, as well as the multi-stakeholder equity and anti-racism committee that has been active in the district for so long. So thank you again so much for coming. It really is, to echo Sunny, it's incredible to see how many of you came out on a sunny night in May to show that this is important. And we all look forward to working with you, to raising up all voices in unity going forward. Thank you. Have a good night.